When we are selling, how can we center the needs and the desires of the person who's in front of us? How can we speak with people rather than at people? Most importantly, how can we always remember that we can be candid and sharp, but we can also be kind and empathetic?
Alexia, I'm super excited to have you join me for this episode of Coffee with Closers. Every entrepreneur has an interesting story of how they became an entrepreneur. Obviously, you're a certified coach, consultant. You help entrepreneurs and business leaders and aspiring leaders on how to really appear right with their full vigor and strength. So can you share with our audience a little bit about your journey and how you got started?
Yes. So the Cliff Notes version is I am probably one of the least likely people to have wound up developing a career around speaking. And I say that because for the first almost 25-ish years of my life, I was in what could only be referred to as an on again, off again relationship, not with another person, but with myself. Meaning, one moment it would feel like I was tap dancing on eggshells, striving to be liked, to give the right answers, and not be called out for failing to be enough of whomever I thought other people wanted me to be. But that wasn't the full story, because then there would be all these other times, sometimes in very close proximity to those former times, where I loved being center stage. I've always had strong opinions, and I've had that sense most of my life that when the stars align, my voice can make positive impact. But it took a really long time to figure out how to bring both of those pieces of me together, since I would go into high stakes communication situations as a child in college and graduate school and in my first career, never knowing which version of me would come out. Then my career somewhat accidentally wound up leaving me in the training space. I was getting asked more and more to speak at a variety of different professional associations, organizations, universities on a bunch of different subjects. But some of the feedback I would get is, when you speak, something comes alive in me. I'm not sure if it's the way you tell stories, if it's the way you ask questions, but I would love to hear or have a conversation with you more just about speaking. And so after that happened enough times, I recognized that's really where I wanted to focus my coaching and training work, was not just getting people comfortable speaking. I think there's this misnomer that confidence is the problem. I'm sure we'll dig into this, but usually it's not about confidence. It's that people simply haven't built the 5 core competencies of vocal empowerment. And that's why at some point they're feeling awkward or they're not getting the results they want from their communication. And so for the last 16, this coming February, 17 years, I've had a blast being able to work with a variety of different organizations, helping their executives all the way down to entry level folks be able to harness the mindset and the skill set to be able to walk into any room, into any conversation, and onto any stage and speak up for themselves, their ideas, their companies, and call people to consistently as well as ethically take action.
So you're saying there's hope for people who are introverts and don't feel confident to get in front of people or even speak up in a small conference room. There's hope for those people. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I'm wired toward introversion. Although, fun fact, I recently took the MBTI for maybe my 3rd or 4th time, and it had been at least a decade since I'd taken it. And now I'm showing as an extrovert. So I don't know if you speak enough and train enough, eventually you'll inch to the other side. But for sure, when I started my business, and definitely through college and graduate school, unapologetically an introvert.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about it, right? So I think oftentimes we kind of expect leaders and anybody who's got some sort of an authority to be very confident, outspoken, commanding attention, and like really being able to own the room or whatever you call it, right? Like be able to like really command attention in that room. So like, what are some strategies that you give to leaders, somebody who's aspiring to be a leader, to building those communication skills? And I think you mentioned like 5 different traits, or in your early opening, you mentioned those 5 different characteristics or traits that would make someone a good communicator.
So at Step Into Your Moxie, we take somewhat an unorthodox approach. And what I mean by that is, if somebody's truly a rising leader, maybe a manager or a director, then for them, it's probably about credibility, likability, trust, being able to find strategic ways to get their voice into more conversations, to be able to advocate for themselves and to show their value. We'll talk about that in a moment. But for those who are executive or senior leaders, it's often quite the opposite, meaning people are not wondering if they're credible, but they
Mhm.
might not know if that person is trustworthy. And so a lot of the work we do with senior level leaders is focused on how to bring in more vulnerability into their communication, particularly in high stakes situations. How to be able to tell stories that don't position them as the leader as the hero, but position the people who are listening as the hero. How to be able to admit when they don't have answers, not in a way that diminishes their credibility, but that shows that in their humanness, they are just like the folks that they are seeking to lead.
Mhm.
And so we found that whether we're working with those emerging leaders or the more experienced leaders, that there's 5 core components that ideally everybody is able to possess for vocal empowerment. The beginning one is learning how to play nicely with our inner voice. So most of us are no stranger to self-talk, but oftentimes we think that we just have to shut the self-talk off, then everything will be rainbows and cupcakes. The issue, though, is not usually the self-talk, particularly when we're going into high-stakes speaking situations. It's that we accept that as the truth and that we don't know how to talk back to it. So that's a key piece, is learning how to recognize, but also how to turn that monologue that might be happening in one's brain into a dialogue.
Mhm.
The second component is learning how to play nicely with physiological sensation. So if you were to ask most people who are on the cusp of doing something big or saying something big, how they feel, they're probably going to say, I'm anxious or I'm nervous, which is a story, not necessarily based on truth. What they're really feeling is sensation, but that same sensation they're feeling might be like what they feel when they meet their future partner for the first time. We don't have to code it as a negative when it's really our body's way of revving up and showing that we're in the game. So a big piece of the work we do, and oftentimes senior leaders are like, you're going to ask me to start to name my sensations and learn how to control my breath. And the answer is yes, because it can make profound difference in how we feel. And as a result, how we appear. Are we appearing like we're confident, or are we appearing like we're becoming undone? The third component, and these aren't necessarily, you work your inner voice and you work physiological sensation. Ideally, we need to be working all of these things at the same time. But the third is messaging. And this is a tricky one because we have to look at cultural context to make sure that the messaging we're using is appropriate. Gender, is this leaving out parts of the population? Is it accessible? Is the messaging we're using not able to be accessed by people because of a disability? So, really looking at messaging that is ethical, that is persuasive, and that's also inclusive. The fourth component is presence. So oftentimes we think we need to puff up and posture and prove that we should be in the room. As I mentioned, there might need to be a little bit of that for an emerging leader. For a more experienced leader, it's often the opposite. But what people are really hungry for are leaders who they feel are really seeing them and who are comfortable being seen. Leadership is such a vulnerable act if we're doing it right. And so a lot of presence is about helping people not make eye contact in a literal way, but be comfortable with visibility, really being seen by others, and genuinely showing that they're seeing the people that they are seeking to influence and lead. And last, but most certainly not least, is possessing the ability to move people to take action. If we want to have influence, we can't just do a lot of informing and getting people to nod their heads and agree. Ultimately, we want people to shift their thinking or their behavior or create new habits as a result of our communication. And so there's an art and science to that as well.
That's really well kind of structured, the model that you have. So if we can spend the time on the last two elements, right? So you talked about like really being, I forgot the exact terminology you used to describe it, but it's not, you're not overly coming across as this authoritative figure, but you're really being vulnerable and expressing yourself and being relatable in some sense, right? And I
Yes.
think the natural tendency as a leader is to avoid any sense of weakness being demonstrated in any way possible, because you want to make sure that everybody knows that you got it all under control. You don't want to share any weaknesses or failures or mistakes you've ever made. So how do you, especially you're also afraid, like especially if you're sitting across the table from a prospect, or maybe you're standing in front of your employees, in those instances you really want to be putting your best selves forward. What advice would you give a leader what sort of vulnerabilities are like really okay to share, and which ones maybe not like it's a no, like you don't want to be sharing those.
It's striking to find that balance between not positioning oneself as a know-it-all and having all the answers, and not seeming like you're ill-prepared for the role. So I'll give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
When COVID first started back in March 2020, or at least started here in the United States back in March 2020, I had a lot of leaders who were coming to me and saying, I have no idea what to say to my employees right now. I don't know how long we're going to work from home. I have no idea if we're going to be able to stay open. I don't know. And so many of them initially wanted to put together these talking points of quite the opposite. This is what's going to happen. And if something changes, we'll keep you updated. And not only was it disingenuous because it was inaccurate, but it also showed a total lack of humanity. And I think a lot of senior leaders were really taken to task for seeming like robots in a moment that was really scary. And so through a lot of our work, we helped people identify what they did know, communicate what they didn't, but more importantly, share how they would continue to relay information as they made decisions. So for example, somebody might say, this is a really scary time for me included. I have no idea what tomorrow is going to look like. Here's what I know today. As of today, we'll be doing X, Y, Z. For the foreseeable future, we'll be doing a once a week debrief for all employees at this day and this time, sharing updates. We'll also have opportunities to hear from you about what's working and what isn't. I imagine we're going to be in an unprecedented time for a while. And so please know we're doing the best we can and we're open to feedback. And I won't continue to go on, but it's about making people feel safe, even in the ambiguity.
Mm-hmm. And the last point you had mentioned was the fifth item was actually propelling people to actually take action. So what are some specific strategies that leaders can make, especially in those kind of high stake moments? There's a lot, people are paralyzed and they may not be able to take action, and you need to get these people to move and take whatever necessary step, right? So what strategies would you recommend leaders follow?
One of the best things leaders can do in high stakes moments is ask for people to share back what they're taking away and what they're committed to doing. So a classic coaching principle. But when people are not just told, this is what I need you to do, but they're asked, so Alexia, tell me what you're taking away from this meeting, what timeline it's going to take for you to implement. Then suddenly I'm taking responsibility for what I'm going to do so we can check in and make sure that we are on the same page. You can ask questions like, what's the payoff when you do 1, 2, 3? What's the cost if nothing changes? So using questions rather than fear or force to enroll people in your vision is one important and usually very successful strategy. Another thing to keep in mind, particularly, I know a lot of your audience is involved in sales and in marketing, is making sure, especially in uncomfortable, scary times, which I think we've been in for the last 3 years, and they're certainly not going away anytime soon, is to make sure that we're not only hitting pain points, but we're also talking about personal motivators. Right now in Las Vegas, where I call home, we are inundated with mosquitoes for the first time in history. And whenever somebody says, want to stop the pain, it makes me think of like pulling out mosquito spray. But pulling out the mosquito spray and stopping myself from getting bitten isn't the thing that's going to compel me to take action. It just gets me through. If we're seeking to move people into something that is visionary, transformational, and all we're doing is talking about pain, it's not the thing that's going to compel them to want to work longer hours, to be able to be vulnerable, to put in some elbow grease. But when we keep the vision around what can be possible, we speak to what might be motivating people: more time, more influence, more impact, deeper sense of self-worth or self-trust. If we message those, that's more likely to have a lasting and positive impact in compelling people to take action.
So some of the strategies that you're bringing up is actually usable in sales scenarios. So you mentioned the personal motives, and oftentimes when you're selling, you don't want to get, super sensitive about, their personal motives and, hey, what do you want to do? How this is going to impact your life? all of those things. Those are very hard questions to ask, and especially in a business setting, you're trying to sell some sort of a business service or product offering that's more like business, or you're talking ROI for the business, but you don't necessarily have the comfort level to be able to ask a lot of personal questions on how this might impact that person on the other end personally. So what advice would you give in terms of structuring questions that is not going to make them become defensive? Oh, I'm going to get a promotion, or I'm going to get this bonus or whatever. And nobody wants to come forward and admit that as one of the personal motives. Like, how could you be, without manipulating them, how could you get that out of them? What sort of questions or opening leading questions could you ask?
There are few, if any, questions or conversations we can't have if they fuse candor with kindness and
Mm-hmm.
empathy. And so the energy
Mm-hmm.
that we use to ask questions is as important as the questions themselves. So when I am working on sales pitches, let's say, whether it's for someone who is going after venture capital or it's somebody in a more traditional sales situation for a product or service, oftentimes the pitch itself is fine. Yet what's
Mm-hmm.
happening is it's cold. And of course, I'm talking about face to face, not just written messaging at the moment. But sometimes taking a moment to breathe, thinking about making eye contact, and sharing a personal anecdote, then asking the question can change the way it's received. So if someone says to me, tell me about your money history, for example, I'm going to shut down and
Mm-hmm.
get very defensive. But if somebody comes to me and says, if you're anything like me, you might have had a complicated relationship to money throughout your life. That's one of the reasons that brought me to coaching, was wanting to help people recognize that it's normal to find finance hard and that there are strategies and techniques to make it easier. So I'm curious to hear from you. What have been
Mm-hmm.
some of the financial milestones that have brought you to have interest in our product or in our service? That lands really
Mm-hmm.
differently than, again, if I just went straight for the kill and asked, tell me your money story.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. So obviously, one of the concepts that you teach is executive presence. So can you define what that is?
Yes, it's my favorite question and my least favorite question. And I mean that because
Mm-hmm.
executive presence isn't about us deciding we have it or we don't. It's contextual, and it's the people that we're seeking to communicate with and call in determining, will they follow us? So in those moments
Mm-hmm.
where people are called in and they will follow us, that's when we knew we had executive presence, versus moments where we might have in theory done the things right in terms of communication, but people
Mm-hmm.
didn't feel invested. That's how we know we didn't have presence. Now, the way I would define it is possessing the mindset and the skill set to be able to walk into any room, into any conversation, onto any stage, and consistently and ethically call people in to take action. But I want
Mm-hmm.
people to recognize that it's not something that we achieve and then it's always there. The good news about that is anytime where it feels like we didn't have the influence we want, in the next conversation we have or the next presentation we give, we can always start again. And the downside is we might have had an amazing keynote. So I deliver keynotes, I work with keynote speakers, and it's like, that was awesome. People came up afterwards. They were already asking me when was I available to come to their organization. And then the next one was crickets. And so sometimes it's,
Mm-hmm.
we did all the same things in theory, but the way we made people feel was different, or we didn't make people feel much of
Mm-hmm.
anything at all. And so therefore our presence waned.
Understood. So how do you strike a balance between like projecting confidence versus being very authentic, right? Especially as a leader, like you said, if you're doing like a keynote speaking or anything like that, you need to kind of have a fine balance between the
All
two.
communication that's good is audience centered. And so oftentimes we use as
Mm-hmm.
a filter how we want to perform when we're preparing for strategic communication, whether it's on stage or a conversation or anything else. The problem with that is most people aren't deciding about our merit based on our lack of filler words or based on the beautiful structure we use for our presentation. Those things can contribute to our credibility, but they're not nearly as important
Mm-hmm.
as the others. And when I say others, I mean how people felt. Did they have an aha moment? Did they feel that we understood them, that our solution is a solution that they're going after? And so, as we are trying to develop our presence, self awareness can get
Mm-hmm.
us to a certain level of success. Yet oftentimes we need outside folks to be able to say, it's not about the filler words, but you always have this thing where every time you say something uncomfortable, you look up. And so there's a breach in credibility. People aren't going to trust you for us to have the maximum impact. But we want to use as a metric, how is my audience likely to receive me? And how do I show myself as somebody who's ethical and trustworthy and knowledgeable? And then we make our adjustments based on that rather than I'm trying to be perfect.
Understood. So obviously you have a lot of experience working with public speakers, helping them with their ability to become a thought leader in the space. So there's a lot of mechanical things and strategic things that they have to do to position themselves as a subject matter expert or a thought leader. So what advice would you give someone who's aspiring to be a thought leader in their space? What steps could they take to become one?
I'm always surprised when folks come to me and they want to start going after speaking opportunities. And the last thing they want to do is reach out to their existing network with what I call a help a colleague out email, name what they're wanting to speak on, the kinds of audiences that are a great fit, and ask for help. They would so much rather pay for a list of speaking opportunities and pitch cold. And I get that. It's very vulnerable to go to people that we're in relationship with and ask for something, because that person could say no. And then if they do, we go into a story that means they don't like us. However, the majority of the first opportunities we're going to get as speakers are probably from people who've either already seen us talk on a stage, heard us on a podcast, or at the very least, somebody who knows our work and recognizes that we can have positive impact on an audience. So that's my first, is let the people who you are already in proximity with know what you're up to and how they can help before going after the cold things. A second tip is that oftentimes we allow others to dictate what we are a subject matter expert on. I don't recommend that approach. For the first 5 or 6 years that I was a professional speaker, I maybe gave the same keynote twice every time I was customizing. And that didn't do the great service I thought it did for event organizers, because it meant I was never masterful with my content. I was always trying to memorize it and get it out. But when we take the time to say, this is the idea that I want to be known for, or in the TED world, the idea that I want to spread, and we spend the time working a beautiful outline that presents the problem, the cause of that problem, how we are uniquely poised to be able to solve it individually or through our organization, and that we do that again and again, we're going to be that much more on our game when we deliver that presentation. People are going to know what to book us for and how to think of us. And it's going to make everything just so much easier because we're not constantly in content creation mode.
So the fear that I have, especially as I go on podcasts and things like that, I kind of talk about that framework that we teach in our organization as well. But you feel like, well, if I keep saying the same thing in multiple podcasts, people have already heard this and it's just sounds repetitive. So you have that fear. Like, how do you overcome that
That's a
fear,
great question.
or should you even be?
If you have somebody in your community who has gone to every podcast you've been on and listened, you have some amazing followers. And I'm joking somewhat, but we often think that people are going to follow us and listen to everything that we say, which is just not true. What happens, particularly in a podcast interview, is we may have our main talking points, but because we're being interviewed, inevitably, we're going to think of a story that is unique to that question that's being asked, but we want to still steer the conversation around the things that we most want to teach so that it's valuable for the listener. When it comes to a presentation, I can't tell you how many stages I've been on with New York Times bestselling authors right around the time they have a new book being released. So I can think of Brene Brown several books back. And there were 2 conferences I was at with her where she was the big opening keynote speaker. I spoke later at that event. And I mean, maybe an anecdote at the beginning to make it logical for the audience, and the final send-off was different. But the slides were the same. Certainly the big idea was the same. The stories were the same. And she was artful in every moment because she had excelled in it. Now, it doesn't mean we want to be delivering the same talk for 15 years. That's going to get stale. But usually 6 to 18 months, depending on how often we're churning out a new program, a new product, a new service, is about the time we want to commit to one primary signature talk. Now, for those who really want to go on the keynote circuit. Oftentimes, talent agents or event organizers will ask for multiple talks, but spoiler alert,
Mm-hmm.
you might have 3 different titles, slightly different talking points. It's the same big idea, even if you're framing
Mm-hmm.
it slightly differently, because this is what it looks like for a healthcare audience, or this is what it looks like for tech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just actually saw Ben Hardy. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if you know him. He written a book called 10x is easier than 2x. I saw him on 2 stages, kind of similar to your experience. It was kind of the same message, but it was one was more of a sales conference. So he was talking a lot about like the sales goals and things like that. The other one was more like an entrepreneurial conference, and it was slightly tailored toward kind of big vision, and how big vision is actually kind of the concept of not just 2x and linear growth as opposed to exponential growth. And he was explaining, but it was similar, like you said, it was almost exactly the
Because it's
same
a
talk,
system.
but he just kind of
It,
tailored it a
it
little
wouldn't
bit
support his
to the
audience
audience.
to show up and suddenly talk about storytelling, because that's not his thing. Much like I
His
have a
topic,
lot
yeah.
of different audiences. We do a lot in tech. We do some things in healthcare. I'm in Las Vegas, so we work in hospitality and gaming. And it's not that we're not that we're tone deaf and we assume the same story that we tell in healthcare is the same story we tell in tech. It isn't. But vocal empowerment
Mm-hmm.
doesn't change if we're talking about tech leaders or we're talking to physicians who want to make patients feel safe. The way we frame those
Mm-hmm.
principles is different. The way we talk to audiences is different, but the methodology is pretty
Mm-hmm.
similar.
So obviously, like I said, I think even for him, someone who's a well recognized author, and you haven't even heard of him, so you would think like there's a lot of people know him and they probably hear the same talk. But I guess we just have to remove that fear. A lot of these fear, right, just holds us back from doing what we're supposed to do. So you're an author, you're a speaker, you're a coach. So certainly you've written a book, Step Into Your
Mm-hmm.
Moxie. So can you tell our audience a little bit about some key takeaway from there, especially when it comes to,
Yes.
influence?
So the subtitle of the book, which is really the heart of the book, is How to Amplify Your Voice, Visibility, and Influence in the World. And for those who can't see the
Mhm,
book, it
I see it
is
on the back. Yeah.
bright pink.
Hmm.
It was designed for an audience of those who identify as women. However, it is not specifically
Hmm.
just for women. A lot of the principles that we've been talking about today are principles from the book. So when it comes to sales, for
Hmm.
example, I referenced this idea that is embodied in the play and the movie Glengarry Glen Ross of always be closing, got to sell harder and faster. And that's a
Hmm.
more masculine model of selling. Not saying men sell that way, but
Hmm.
more masculine model of selling and of speaking. And yet the times
Hmm.
when we're in really require something different that I refer to as going for the holy yes. And holy doesn't need to mean anything religious. I'm Greek
Hmm.
ancestrally, and it comes from the word hagios, holy, which means different or set apart. So when we are selling,
Hmm.
how can we center the needs and the desires of the person who's in front of us? How can we speak with people rather than at people? But most
Hmm.
importantly, how can we always remember that we can be candid and sharp, but we can also be kind and empathetic, and that that's not just the right thing to do, but from a sales
Hmm.
perspective, it's also the thing that more often than not is not going to just move people to action once, but it's going to instill loyalty so that people want to come back to us again and again and again. One of my favorite stats from our
Hmm.
organization to share is that we average 75% retention for our clients. So we don't
Hmm.
work with tens of thousands of companies in the course of a year, but the ones that we work with come back again and again and again. And
Hmm.
it's because we're not focusing on that first sale, we're focusing on that relationship. And so to bring it back to the book, one of the things that comes through in each chapter is that idea of moving people to take action is not about conforming to hustle culture and trying to force people to do anything using manipulation. That art of calling in is really about us being able to show up as our smart and slightly imperfect selves, be clear. We don't need to be apologetic, and be real and be human.
Hmm. It's a great note to end our conversation. I certainly enjoyed our conversation, and thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to continuing to see more of your work, and leveraging some of your expertise in my own personal development, and
Thank you.
leadership.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with your audience.
Sounds good.
This episode of Coffee with Closers is brought to you by OneIMS, a leading digital marketing agency helping businesses win new customers. To request a free marketing ROI audit, please visit oneims.com. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. To make sure you never miss an episode, please subscribe.